Recently, I was invited to appear on a podcast to discuss connection restoring rumination, which is about why you can't stop thinking about them and what facilitates healing. As I was preparing to go on this podcast, I was taking detailed notes, and I kept working with them until they turned into another article. On Oofana, there's so much detail here, so I will be reading from the article itself. Let's dive in. A certain amount of rumination is perfectly normal, especially when we're attracted to someone, uncertain where we stand in trying to make sense of a developing relationship. We meet someone and feel a connection. We're not entirely sure whether they share our interest or how they feel about us. We look for signs, we replay conversations, and wonder what they meant by something they said or did. We think about when to call, text, or reach out, particularly in today's dating environment where ambiguity, mixed signals, ghosting, inconsistent communication have become increasingly common. Many people find themselves spending considerable time trying to make sense of what is happening. This tendency often becomes even more pronounced when a relationship begins to unravel or comes to an end. We replay interactions, search for answers, revisit memories, and construct explanations in an attempt to understand what happened. In many instances, the mind becomes preoccupied with restoring a sense of clarity, certainty, or connection. While some degree of reflection is both natural and healthy, there comes a point where the process can become repetitive and self-perpetuating. Rather than helping us move forward, it keeps us psychologically tethered to the individual we've grown attached to, the relationship, and the unresolved emotions surrounding it. Although some relational patterns begin early in life, they continue to be shaped through childhood and adolescence. Conditional love, parentification, bullying, rejection, abuse, abandonment, heartbreak, and other significant experiences all contribute to how we learn to relate to ourselves and others. Over time, these experiences create expectations about love, connection, belonging, and loss that influence our relationships well into adulthood. One of the things I've become increasingly aware of over the years is that a great many people have never learned to work effectively with their own emotional responses. While some individuals certainly avoid, suppress, or distance themselves from difficult emotions, many are not doing so consciously. Rather, they lack the capacity, skill, understanding, or awareness necessary to access and process them. For those struggling with attachment wounds, who have experienced abandonment, conditional love, parentification, rejection, abuse, or other forms of relational trauma, the impressions left by these experiences, along with the undigested emotional residue attached to them, often remain within the individual, operating largely outside of conscious awareness. These unresolved experiences continue expressing themselves through the physical body while also shaping expectations and influencing how people relate to others. As a result, individuals often find themselves repeatedly drawn toward people and reenacting relational dynamics that reflect aspects of their unresolved wounding. The resulting distress activates powerful emotions, yet because these emotions are not being directly accessed, metabolized, and integrated, attention frequently shifts toward analyzing the relationship, searching for explanations, or attempting to make sense of what happened. It is often at this point that rumination begins, as an attempt to understand, manage, or resolve the distress. In many instances, rumination represents an attempt to resolve something that remains unfinished. Following relational rupture or dissolution, the individual may find themselves attempting to restore connection, coherence, certainty, or emotional equilibrium. Yet when the grief, fear, abandonment, pain, and other emotions fueling the rumination remain outside of awareness, they often become trapped in repetitive cycles of thinking rather than moving toward genuine resolution. In many instances, people are far more aware of the thoughts than the emotions driving them. They may spend hours replaying conversations, analyzing interactions, or trying to understand what happened while remaining largely disconnected from the grief, fear, shame, loneliness, longing, or abandonment pain beneath the surface. As a result, attention remains focused on the person they formed an attachment to and the narrative they've constructed around the relationship rather than the highly charged emotions beneath the surface that are driving it. Many people mistakenly assume that if they could just think differently, gain enough insight, or find the right answer, their rumination would come to an end. But what they're experiencing is much more than that. It's attachment, neurochemistry, physiology, habit circuitry, emotional memory, and stress activation. The individual caught up in the cycle of rumination is not simply trying to solve a problem. Their entire being has become organized around restoring connection, finding relief, and resolving what feels unfinished. When someone becomes romantically attached and then experiences uncertainty, rejection, ghosting, abandonment, or the loss of relationship, what follows is far more than a problem of thought or perception. The brain and body are reacting as though something deeply significant has been lost. Systems involved in attachment, reward, motivation, stress, and emotional regulation all become activated. As a result, the person may find themselves repeatedly thinking about the person they've grown attached to and the relationship, replaying conversations, searching for answers, imagining future scenarios, checking messages, or longing for renewed contact. This is one reason rumination can be so difficult to stop. The person is not merely trying to solve a problem, they are attempting to find relief from a powerful state of emotional, physiological, and biochemical activation. The repetitive thinking often reflects the distress that arises when an important bond is threatened or disrupted. Whether real or perceived, the threat of loss can feel profoundly unsettling. For those carrying significant attachment wounds, it may activate deep fears of abandonment, disconnection, and isolation. The mind naturally attempts to make sense of and resolve distress, often through repeated thinking, analysis, and mental review. This is also why intellectual insight alone is often insufficient. A person may understand exactly what is happening and still find themselves pulled back into the same thoughts, emotions, and behavioral patterns. Until the underlying emotional, physiological, and attachment-related processes are sufficiently addressed, the mind often continues returning to the person one has grown attached to and the relationship in an attempt to resolve what feels unfinished. Dopamine plays a central role in this process. Romantic love and rejection activate reward and motivation circuits involved in craving, pursuit, and anticipation. When access to the person becomes uncertain or unavailable, the brain often intensifies its efforts to restore contact. This can lead to obsessive thinking, repeated checking behaviors, fantasizing, replaying conversations, and a persistent hope that the connection can somehow be restored. In many respects, the process resembles addiction. Norepinephrine and adrenaline further amplify the experience by increasing vigilance, alertness, anxiety, urgency, and threat detection. The individual is not simply thinking about the relationship, their entire physiology has become mobilized. Sleep may become disrupted, thoughts may race, attention becomes narrowly focused on the perceived loss. At the same time, uncertainty, attachment disruption, and prolonged rumination can activate the body's stress response, including the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, leading to the release of cortisol, one of the body's primary stress hormones. This can contribute to heightened vigilance, anxiety, emotional reactivity, disrupted sleep, and a tendency to remain preoccupied with the person one has grown attached to, the relationship, and the perceived threat of loss. When the mind repeatedly returns to the source of distress, the stress response can remain activated for extended periods of time. Oxytocin and vasopressin, which play important roles in bonding and attachment, also contribute to the intensity of the experience. Together, they help create emotional significance, pair bonding, and a sense that a particular person matters deeply. When connection is threatened or lost, longing and attachment distress may intensify rather than diminish. Another important and often overlooked factor involves the body's endogenous opioid system. Human connection can be deeply regulating and soothing. Separation, loss, and attachment disruption can therefore feel much like withdrawal. This is one reason heartbreak can feel physically painful, emotionally overwhelming, and be extraordinarily difficult to get over. Serotonin may also play a role. Reduced serotonergic activity has been associated with obsessive thinking, intrusive thoughts, compulsive mental review, and difficulty disengaging attention. This helps to explain why romantic fixation can take on an obsessive compulsive quality. Over time, repeated rumination strengthens neural pathways and habit circuits. The more often someone replays conversations, checks messages, revisits memories, imagines future outcomes, or mentally rehearses scenarios, the more efficient and automatic those pathways become. This is one reason insight alone is often insufficient. A person may understand the pattern intellectually while still finding themselves repeatedly pulled back into it. Chronic stress and emotional distress can also influence inflammatory and immune signaling throughout the body. Fatigue, digestive disturbances, mood instability, increased pain sensitivity, and emotional reactivity may all become part of the experience. What people are experiencing is not merely psychological, it involves the entire organism. This is why talk therapy, while valuable, is not always sufficient by itself. Understanding the narrative can be immensely helpful, but the narrative is frequently being driven by unresolved attachment wounds, emotional pain, reward-seeking circuitry, stress physiology, and deeply conditioned patterns of relating. Lasting change often requires interventions that engage the body, emotional wounds, and relational patterns, in addition to cognitive understanding. So why do some people assume rejection, abandonment, or loss when another person's behavior is ambiguous? Part of the answer lies in the impressions left by earlier experiences. We carry within us not only the memories of our relationships with parents, caregivers, friends, and romantic partners, but also the emotional residue attached to those experiences. Sadness, grief, disappointment, feelings of loss, and the pain of rejection or abandonment can continue to influence how we perceive and interpret the behavior of others long after the original experiences have passed. When we view the person we've grown attached to and our interactions with them through the lens of these unresolved wounds, it becomes easier to misinterpret ambiguity. A delayed text message, a change in tone, canceled plans, or someone being less responsive to our attempts to communicate may be experienced not as uncertainty, but as evidence of rejection, abandonment, or impending loss. Once we begin interpreting another person's behavior through the lens of rejection, abandonment, or loss, it becomes easy to focus on information that appears to confirm those conclusions while overlooking information that points in a different direction. The more convinced we become that a particular interpretation is correct, the less likely we are to question it, even when alternative explanations may exist. One of the most helpful things we can do is learn to distinguish between what actually happened and the meaning we've assigned to it. A delayed text message, canceled plans, or a change in someone's behavior does not automatically mean rejection, abandonment, or loss. By slowing down and examining our assumptions, we can begin responding to the present situation rather than reacting to it through the lens of past wounds. The first step is to acknowledge what happened. Notice the meaning you've assigned to it and then consider other possible explanations. How do painful experiences eventually become the stories and beliefs we hold about ourselves, other people, and relationships? We not only carry the emotional residue of our experiences, we also come to identify with the conclusions we draw from them. A child who repeatedly experiences criticism, rejection, or other forms of mistreatment may conclude, I'm not good enough. Something is wrong with me. I'm unlovable. Someone who experiences abandonment may come to believe, people always leave me. And others learn, I have to earn love. Over time, these conclusions and beliefs influence how we see ourselves, what we expect from others, and how we interpret our relationships. They shape not only our understanding of past experiences, but also what we come to expect from others, often leading us to predict rejection, abandonment, criticism, or loss before they have actually occurred. One of the challenges is that these beliefs are often rooted in emotionally charged experiences that have not been fully processed or integrated. As a result, many people attempt to change the belief while leaving the underlying emotional wound untouched. They may tell themselves, I am worthy, I am lovable, I am enough, yet the grief, shame, rejection, abandonment, pain, and other emotional residue attached to earlier experiences continues operating beneath the surface. As long as these deeper emotional layers remain undigested, the old beliefs continue exerting a powerful influence regardless of what the conscious mind is attempting to believe. One of the most important steps in healing is learning to recognize these stories for what they are, interpretations formed in response to painful experiences, not necessarily objective truths. By becoming aware of them, questioning them, and working through the emotional residue beneath them, we create the possibility for new ways of relating to ourselves and others. One of the challenges we face in relationships is that we often assume our emotional reactions accurately reflect what is happening. When powerful emotions are activated, it becomes easy to interpret another person's behavior through the lens of these emotions. For example, feelings of anxiety may be interpreted as evidence that something is wrong. Feelings of abandonment may be taken as proof that someone is pulling away. Intense chemistry may be mistaken for compatibility, yet our emotional reactions are not always reliable indicators of what is actually occurring in our relationships. Part of the reason for this is that we do not experience relationships in a vacuum. Past experiences often influence how we interpret present-day interactions. A person's silence, a delayed response, or emotional distance may trigger feelings associated with earlier experiences of rejection, abandonment, or neglect, causing us to react not only to what is happening now, but also to what it reminds us of. The emotion itself may be real and valid. The conclusions we draw from it may not be. One of the most important skills we can develop is learning to distinguish between what we are feeling and the meaning we have assigned to those feelings. One of the paradoxes of romantic love is that many people simultaneously desire closeness while fearing the very things that intimacy can bring. They long for connection, reassurance, acceptance, and love, yet fear rejection, abandonment, vulnerability, disappointment, and loss. The painful impressions and emotions associated with childhood wounds, past heartbreaks, rejection, abandonment, and other deeply wounding experiences often continue living within us. These unresolved experiences can make it more difficult to fully open our hearts, diminishing our capacity to give and receive love. As a result, relationships can become a source of internal conflict. Part of the individual is moving toward connection, while another part is attempting to protect them from potential pain. The more emotionally significant the relationship becomes, the stronger these internal conflicts can become. One of the goals of healing is not to eliminate our desire for connection, but to gradually develop the capacity to remain open to connection while tolerating the uncertainty and vulnerability that meaningful relationships inevitably involve. True healing does not occur simply by forcing ourselves to stop thinking, suppressing our emotions, or overwhelming ourselves with more intensity than we can tolerate. As we learn to remain present with difficult emotions, uncertainty, and relational discomfort without immediately reacting, seeking reassurance, or becoming lost in rumination, new ways of responding begin to emerge. Over time, these new responses become increasingly familiar and available, making it easier to navigate future challenges with greater stability and resilience. Once we understand what is driving our rumination, the question naturally becomes, how do we facilitate healing? If rumination were simply a thinking problem, the solution would be relatively straightforward. We would identify the distorted thought, replace it with the more accurate one, and move on. Yet for many people, it's not that simple. The attachment wounds, emotional pain, physiological activation, and deeply conditioned patterns that drive rumination often continue operating even after considerable insight has been gained. This was certainly true in my own experience. Struggling with attachment wounds during my mid-20s, I found myself repeatedly reenacting many of the painful dynamics that had characterized my childhood and adolescence. Although psychotherapy provided valuable insight and helped me gain a better understanding of what was happening, understanding alone was not enough. The thoughts continued returning, the emotions remained, and the same patterns continued to play out in my relationships. Intuitively, I sensed that something deeper was required. It was not enough to merely think about what I was experiencing. I needed to turn toward it. Rather than remaining preoccupied with the person or the relationship or story, I needed to immerse myself more fully in the emotions, sensations, and lived experience itself. At times, the emotional pain was overwhelming. I would spend hours breathing softly and deeply while fully immersing my awareness in the grief, longing, abandonment pain, fear, and other emotions that arose. As I continued working with these emotions, I could feel them moving through me in waves. The unhealthy attachments began to soften and dissolve. I found myself becoming less preoccupied with the person, less consumed by what wasn't working, and more accepting of reality as it was. Over time, I came to recognize that this process was engaging the innate healing intelligence residing within my own body and mind. As my exploration continued, I developed other variations of this practice. Sometimes I would bring a particular relationship or relational dynamic to mind and notice the feelings and bodily sensations that arose in response to it. Rather than becoming lost in the story, I would immerse my awareness in the feelings themselves, breathing softly and deeply while following them through their progression. At other times, I would bring the person to mind and simply notice what emerged within me. On other occasions, I would immerse my awareness deep within my chest or abdomen, where I often found significant amounts of emotional residue being held. I also discovered that walking while working with these emotions to be profoundly helpful. As I walked, I would remain present with whatever was surfacing emotionally, while allowing the breath, movement, rhythm, and presence of the earth itself to help diffuse the intensity. Over time, I found myself becoming more grounded, stable, embodied, and emotionally resilient. What I eventually discovered was that these practices allowed me to access the underlying emotions, driving the rumination and fueling the attachment itself. As those emotions were acknowledged, experienced, and digested, the rumination often diminished naturally. The mind became quieter, insight emerged on its own, acceptance increased, letting go became less of an act of will and more a natural consequence of healing. While I often sat with my eyes closed, breathing from the depths of any feelings or bodily sensations that surfaced, I also found myself working with this practice while lying in bed on nights when I couldn't sleep or when the emotional pain became especially intense. Over time, I began bringing the practice into my everyday life and interactions, breathing into any feelings or bodily sensations that arose throughout the day. I found this especially helpful during conversations, as it allowed me to remain grounded in my body while staying more fully present with the person in front of me. When I was struggling with my own attachment wounds and caught in the destructive cycle of rumination, there was often a profound sense of helplessness, an inability to effect any kind of meaningful change. Even worse, the pattern was self-reinforcing, perpetuating itself. As I continued working with these practices, I found they enabled me to access the underlying source of the problem, where I could begin to effect change and facilitate healing. As the wounds gradually began to heal, there was a corresponding reduction in the rumination. Not only was I carrying the trauma and attachment wounds of childhood and adolescence, I was also highly dissociated. Much of the emphasis of my practice is becoming more and more embodied while accessing successively deeper layers of the residual lived experience and emotions held within my body. Over the past 38 years, I have continued refining and teaching these practices to the people I work with, in both individual and group settings. While the specific methods may vary, the underlying principle remains the same. Deep and lasting change requires more than understanding our thoughts. It requires learning to access and work directly with the emotions, bodily sensations, and unresolved experiences that continue driving them. As beneficial as these practices proved to be, I quickly realized they were only part of the picture. While the body and mind possess an enormous capacity for healing, I soon became acutely aware of the limitations of what I could accomplish on my own. Some of the wounds I was struggling with ran extraordinarily deep, and the corresponding patterns proved stubbornly persistent. Additional support was needed. As this realization became increasingly apparent, I found myself exploring virtually every therapeutic intervention that held promise. What follows is a brief overview of some of the interventions I found most helpful in facilitating healing and reducing the rumination. Deep tissue bodywork has been especially helpful in bringing the residue of lived experiences and the emotions held in the musculature and other tissues of the body to the surface. As these emotions emerge, I work with the practice described earlier, breathing softly and deeply while fully immersing my awareness in whatever is arising. Deep tissue bodywork has also helped me feel more comfortable in my body, more grounded, and more fully present in my day-to-day life. Acupuncture has been a valuable support in helping me regulate my body and its physiological processes during periods of emotional distress. I've often found that it promotes a greater sense of balance, stability, emotional equilibrium while reducing some of the physiological activation associated with stress, anxiety, and rumination. For those carrying deep emotional wounds, this can make it easier to remain present with difficult emotions and engage more fully with the healing process. Homeopathic medicine proved helpful in bringing deeply held emotions into conscious awareness. On several occasions, I found that specific remedies surface feelings of grief and other emotions pertaining to heartbreak and other losses held deep within my chest. In addition to supporting the cleansing of my digestive tract, colonics often surfaced fear, anxiety, and other emotions held deep within my abdomen. Sensory deprivation flotation tanks have been especially helpful in facilitating profoundly deep states of relaxation and meditation. Suspended effortlessly in warm water and complete darkness, I often found myself entering states in which my body and mind could deeply decompress. In these deeply relaxed states, it became much easier to access emotions, bodily sensations, and residual lived experiences held within the body. For thousands of years, certain individuals among Native American and other indigenous peoples have developed gifts that enable them to facilitate healing within the body and mind. Over the years, I have had the opportunity to work with a number of gifted healers, and for me, this has been one of the most powerful interventions of all. These sessions often help me access, heal, and transform the deeply wounded parts of myself that had proven difficult to reach through other approaches. Having trained with a traditional Native American doctor from the Kiowa tribe, a significant part of my ongoing training involves going out alone into the mountains to fast for 4 days and nights without food and water. During the vision quests, particularly on the 4th night, I can often feel an extraordinarily powerful presence working within my body and mind. This process has repeatedly helped me access, transform, and digest the residual of early life trauma, other adverse experiences, and the emotions tied to them. As this occurs, I can feel a new foundation gradually taking shape within me, one characterized by greater stability, resilience, clarity, and inner strength. The process I facilitate when working with people individually is much like that of many indigenous healers. Those who work with me often find themselves gaining access to and digesting the residual of past trauma, other adverse experiences, abandonment wounds, and the emotions tied to them in ways that are in many respects similar to what I go through during the vision quest. True healing requires far more than insight and understanding. While understanding can help us make sense of our experience, lasting change often occurs through the combined effect of multiple approaches working together over time. Ultimately, the goal is not simply to eliminate the rumination, but to heal the underlying wounds driving it. As those wounds heal, the rumination diminishes naturally. The mind becomes quieter, acceptance increases, and healthier ways of relating to ourselves and others begin to emerge. Consistency matters. Daily practice matters. Healing requires a willingness to repeatedly turn toward what has been avoided, to remain present with difficult emotions, and do whatever is necessary to facilitate the healing of the body and mind. Although the path is rarely easy, those willing to engage in the process often discover that meaningful change is possible. With time, patience, and consistent effort, even deeply entrenched patterns can begin to soften, to heal, and transform. What once seemed overwhelming gradually becomes more manageable, making it possible to navigate relationships, uncertainty, and loss with greater stability and resilience.